mean, there's stories in all Indigenous communities that act as sort of pillars of the society, basically. Like stories are more than just entertainment. Some of them are like funny, goofy, entertaining things, but stories can also act as like encyclopedias, because just randomly they'll have facts about natural things.
Okay.
But they'll also act as maps, because they'll have very specific details about a place or the setting of the story. So you can go like, oh, I actually know that spot. So the story now where this character walked from here to here, they walked this distance, and it tells you how long it took. So like now it's like a map.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're also like just history of families and where they come from. All of those like those stories aren't as around as much as they were before colonization. But if you can connect yourself to some of those pillars of stories through your family lineage, like, okay, my family were active in this area during the time of that story, so they were probably involved in that storyline. So they can sort of like, you can track them back through that story to where maybe another story is. But there's still lots of gaps.
Right.
But because
how did you start getting interested in all of that stuff?
I've been interested in this since I was young. So yeah, I grew up in Edmonton, and was just like the son of a comedian. My dad's a famous stand-up comedian named Howie Miller, and he's like,
okay,
yeah, he's been doing comedy for a really long time.
Like, it's a name that, because I've followed comedy since I was a kid.
Yeah.
Now, not Canadian comedy,
Sure,
right?
Yeah.
So it's a little bit different, but like that name's it. Like, it seems familiar to me. Like, not that I would know all the information, but that's one of those names that seems really familiar to me. Okay.
Yeah, totally. He's pretty popular in a lot of Indigenous communities, and is still touring quite a bit now. But I was just chatting with him a couple of days ago because he was coming through town on tour, and he was just talking about how he knew Charlie Hill, which is like really cool. And
I don't know the name.
Charlie Hill's like one of the first like Indigenous comedians.
Oh, okay. Wait, so like this is a thing?
Yeah.
So Indigenous comedy is a thing.
Yeah, I think when my dad started, he was just a comedian that was Indigenous.
Okay.
And now that Indigenous communities are sort of more in the limelight or in the mainstream media, then like Indigenous comedy is a thing.
Okay.
But I think that conversation is a larger one, because like I think a lot of people consider me like an Indigenous actor, whereas I like to consider myself an actor who is also Indigenous,
right?
And it's funny when it gets down to like awards or that sort of thing, like a lot of Indigenous art is grouped into one thing, whereas they all might be extremely different.
Oh, okay.
Like I was doing a Fringe tour last year, and there was this reviewer in Winnipeg that like put all of the Indigenous shows into one sort of category, even though our show is wildly different than some of the other shows. So it's like we could have been in the dance category or the drama category or all these other things, but instead we're in the Indigenous category. So it's like, it's great to represent that and to be that sort of image, but it's kind of a detriment because then it just doesn't really go in depth about what our show is about.
It's probably the wrong term, but I get the idea. Like, it's almost a gilded cage. Like, there's benefits that you can pull out of it, but when you don't want to be using those benefits, you still have to be locked into it, kind of
totally.
thing.
Yeah. But it's like a larger, complicated thing. But yeah, in Edmonton, I was growing up the son of a comedian. My dad was part of the 60s Scoop, which means like since the 60s up until even today, like Indigenous kids were adopted out of Native communities and adopted by white parents as a part of assimilation. And they
say that they call that what?
The 60s Scoop.
The 60s Scoop.
Or some people call it the Scoop Up.
Okay.
And it was just happening for a lot of different reasons. Like child services would come in and they would just deem parents like unfit to raise their kids, and it happened like in such a like large area across Canada that like it wasn't just coincidental. Like there was certainly parents that were capable of raising their kids, but they just were not seen fit by the government. So he sort of grew up with like a severance of knowledge with his family, and then that sort of trickled down to us, where we just didn't have that strong connection to the reserve that we do now. And now, like, because I'm doing all of this research with my family, like we've reconnected with that side of our family in a pretty intense way, which is
Talk
great.
to me about that. What do you mean?
Like we've always known that we've had family on the reserve, and we even lived there once when we were kids. But growing up in the city, we just didn't see that side of the family a lot. But now we do, and I feel like there's like a stronger bond there. But growing up without really having a direct connection to the traditional knowledge of your family, you get that knowledge from other places, and the place that you normally get that from is from like movies and TV. And movies and TV when I was growing up, and even when my dad was growing up, that show Indigenous people were just poorly misrepresentations of Indigenous people. Like,
sorry, I'm laughing because I watched like all of your YouTube videos, and I'm immediately drawn to the fucking statue episode.
Totally.
Yeah, and it was like, and I sat, and we'll put links and stuff so that you can see all this stuff, obviously, but like, I sat kind of in awe and just went, fuck. Like, not even thinking about it that way, right?
Yeah, it's a subconscious narrative. And I think the people who started doing those types of stories, they did do it on purpose. Because part of, as I mentioned earlier, like land claims and like having like justifying the title to land only can happen if Native people don't exist and never existed. Right. So to change people's minds and just say like Native people are gone, they created this thing called the Vanishing Indian effect, which a writer, Thomas King, who's like an Indigenous author and like teacher and I think professor who like does a lot of lectures and that sort of thing, he uses this term, the Vanishing Indian effect, to talk about how at the end of Westerns or at the end of most Indigenous stories, the Native people like go beyond the hill. They like leave. They go into the sunset.
You're absolutely right.
But like they go to the other side of the hill and then stay there. Like they don't go to where they come from because they come from right where the story takes place.
Right.
So that subconsciously makes you think like, the Native people are gone somewhere, even though they're from absolutely all over this continent. So like that sort of thing, like seeing Native people represented that way, seeing people represented in this very like mystical and magical sense, which is super cool, but it's very narrow
until it's not.
Like it really kind of defines Indigenous people as one thing, and that thing only existed before colonization.
Don't forget you can subscribe to our full audio episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere you find your audio podcasts. The full episodes, highlights, and our live off-the-floor performance videos can be found at our YouTube channel, and you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at the AVB Podcast. Of course, you'll find links to our incredible sponsors and this week's guest in the description below. The AVB Podcast is part of the Border City Network. Find more great content at bordercitynetwork.com. See you next time, folks. Bye-bye.